Brass monkey's cold, huh? Hey, you think everybody's going to understand that expression? They'll understand, yeah, that it means that it's really cold. I guess so. Hey, fun fact. People say that expression comes from the brass monkey figure racks used to hold cannonballs a few hundred years ago. And when it was really cold, the brass would contract and the cannonballs fall off. But that is likely a myth. The earliest uses of the expression I've come across are from the early 1800s, referring most probably to those, three wise monkey figurines that were very popular then as souvenirs from the Far East. And they are referred to in many ways other than just extreme cold. It could be brass monkey's hot. He could be such a con artist, he could talk the ears off a brass monkey. Yeah, I'll shut up. Yeah, okay. Yep, see you. March 24th, 1952. Some of your best troops are in the mountains, but you want them near the capital as a quick response team, so you move them over. Simple enough, right? Well, you've got to move others to move them, and someone has to go into their former positions. It's still not that hard, right? What if it's 200,000 men, and they're moving along the front lines opposite the enemy? Now it's not so simple. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, we took a look at the poor state of the South Korean economy with its rampant inflation. At the truce table, post-armistice troop rotation numbers were agreed upon, but the thorny issue of POW repatriation remains. The UN commander Matt Ridgway began to think that maybe overtly screening the POWs to see if they'd refuse to go home rather than covertly might make a difference. I'm gonna start this week with a little scene setting. It was brass monkey cold in the back of the open truck. Snow had begun falling early that morning, and now the vehicles were having trouble negotiating the slick, muddy road. Seated on the wooden slat benches in the back of a 6x6 truck, the men hunched over and stared at the floor. They tried to keep the snow out of their clothing, but it was useless. The wet, slushy snow splotched their boots and trousers everywhere their ponchos failed to cover. Soon they were soaked to the skin. Their full packs, lying on the floor, grew soggy. Many of the men had stretched condoms over their rifle muzzles in an effort to keep them dry. The trucks were equipped with canvas covers over the back, but they were furled to facilitate escape in the event that enemy aircraft approached. The men simply got wet. What is going on here? It is March 18th, 1951, and Operation Mixmaster is going on, or getting going. U.S. Marine units from the 1st Marine Division and 10th Corps began moving out of their positions as last week ended, after being relieved by the ROK, South Korean, 8th Division, and are now heading west to positions on the Jamestown line that I talked about last week. U.S. 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet wants to get these guys moved before he or the Chinese and North Koreans can take advantage of the coming of spring and resume offensive operations. It is a lot of ground to cover, and it goes on day and night all week long, moving around like 200,000 men and their equipment hither and yon. They use 5,800 truckloads and Duck W loads, 63 flatbed trailers, 83 railroad cars, 14 landing ships, 2 transport planes, 4 Army truck companies and all their vehicles, and hundreds of Jeeps and Jeep trailers. The heavy stuff is moved by ship or by rail, but they move about 50,000 tons of stuff this week. Impressive as these figures are, they almost pall in significance compared with the meticulous planning and precision logistics required by the week-long move. It was made, without mishap, over main routes that supplied nearly a dozen other divisions on the USAC, 8th U.S. Army in Korea, line, and thus had to be executed as not to interfere with combat support. Mixmaster was a complicated tactical maneuver that involved realignment of UNC divisions across the entire Korean front. So what's the story here? The Marines' first impression is that the new area will be better to defend, or at least less inhospitable than the craggy, freezing mountains they leave behind. And indeed, Ridgway and Van Fleet announced that the move is because they want the ROK to hold the mountain regions because their lighter supply requirements would be easier on Army logistics. This would also put the ROK troops opposite the KPA, the North Korean troops. There was more to the shift of divisions than ensuring more Korean fratricide. Van Fleet and Ridgway had little confidence that the UNC communist armistice negotiations would produce any sort of final agreement unless UNC increased its military pressure on the communists. The 1st Marine Division had been selected to play a big role in any future UNC offensive operations, and it would ensure that the Chinese would not succeed if they started an offensive of equal magnitude. It's also pretty obvious that they're here because this sector defends Seoul and the admin zone around Munsan-ni. The UN delegates to the Panmunjom peace talks come out of Munsan-ni, and Panmunjom is only a few kilometers in front of the advanced UN positions and a few more in front of the main battle line. Supposing there's some sort of incident at Panmunjom or for some reason the communists block the road there, who better to have as the quickest reaction force than the Marines? They have helicopters, they have fighter bombers for close air support. A few of you may say, hang on, the fixed-wing Marine aircraft are under the auspices of the U.S. 5th Air Force, are they not? They are, and that Air Force is very busy conducting the interdiction bombing campaign on North Korea, yeah. However, Marine Aircraft Group 12, which is 2 squadrons of fighter bombers and service units, set up shop at an airfield near Pyeongtaek on the coast, and a transport helicopter squadron and the 1st Marine Aircraft Wings Observation Squadron moved from near the Punch Bowl to an airfield southeast of Munsan-ni. I will quote Ballinger again. The group could reach the front in minutes if necessary, guided and controlled by the Marine Air-Ground Close Air Support System that was envied by the Army and condemned by the U.S. Air Force. I will have more to say about this operation next week, some more thoughts behind it, and how it actually works on paper. I mentioned the ROK 8th Division. I would like to talk a bit more about the ROK Army in general. Now, with the major effort going on to build up and train the South Korean Army, there also comes more pressure on KMAG, the Korean Military Advisory Group. With more ROK personnel, Ridgway wants more KMAG personnel. Makes sense. Back in November, the U.S. Army approved adding 800 spots, which would bring KMAG up to over 1,800. But also back in November, then Acting Secretary of Defense William Foster brought up the question of what exactly they want the final ROK post-war defense force to look like. Before I say anything more, I'll point out that both Douglas MacArthur and Ridgway favored a 10-division army of 250,000 men. Foster asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff this question, and they said that number still sounded good. But President Truman wanted to beef that up. Well, fast forward to the end of January, and the Defense Department concluded that the South Korean economy was not capable of sustaining any significant military expansion in the near future. This is not a problem, they think, because they feel that the force the ROK has now, should it become properly trained, led, and equipped, would be able to deter or at the very least delay any further enemy aggression until reinforcements could come in. They have to keep this in mind. The ROK government was in the throes of a serious financial crisis as a result of steady inflation and hardly in a position to assume additional heavy expenses. It is true. But this was but one facet to the problem. It should not be forgotten that the United States had made commitments to supply many of the military requirements of its NATO allies and was about to sponsor the renaissance of the Japanese Defense Forces as well. With U.S. production not on a full war scale, and with heavy demands at home and abroad to be met, it appeared that ROK Army expansion would have to await a more opportune moment. You may wonder what the South Korean government, specifically President Syngman Rhee, thinks the number is of ROK troops the country will require to ably defend itself. And that number is more than 10 divisions. Also, U.S. Secretary of the Navy Dan Kimball is now on an inspection tour of Korea, and he finds that Van Fleet would like to form 10 additional ROK divisions. I imagine Kimball will report this at some point, and I do wonder how people will feel about it. I mean, Van Fleet is the guy that controls all of the actual boots on the ground, and can see the tactical and strategic situation better than pretty much anyone else. So his opinions should carry a fair amount of weight. Is Ridgway aware of how Van Fleet feels? We shall see. Whatever the case in terms of numbers, there are things that Ridgway has done to at least better the ROK troops' efficiency. These are internal improvements. Back in November, he authorized the Korean Service Corps to increase its numbers to 60,000. That allowed all the carriers and the workers in combat areas to be effectively organized with pretty good control and discipline, which in turn gives the actual combat units more reliable service support. That 60,000 personnel was soon increased to 75,000. There has also been a solid effort to fix one of the most basic weaknesses of the ROK Army: lack of integrated artillery support. Think back to the fully active war a year ago, and the ROK relied mainly on American artillery. But only one 105mm howitzer battalion was assigned for each ROK division, whereas US divisions had 3 105 battalions and 1 150 each. And of course, the American divisions had armor support and way more mortars. Command staffs argued back then that because of the rough terrain, the lack of roads, the supply issues caused by the lack of roads, and equipment simply being unavailable, they couldn't expand the ROK artillery. However, with the war long settled into a static phase, those arguments have been more and more overcome. Last September, 4 new ROK 155mm howitzer battalions were authorized for activation. They had 8 weeks of training with US personnel. In November, they added 3 headquarters battalions and 6 105mm howitzer battalions, and those began training in January. This month, Ridgway has approved a full complement of 3 105s and 1 150 howitzer battalions for each of the 10 ROK divisions. So they are getting there. It looks like, with the training and the schools and all I talked about 2 weeks ago, and increasing the service personnel, that given time, the ROK Army really might become one of the better armed forces in the Far East. Now, the Chinese have also been building up their forces the past few months. Intelligence says they went from a low of 377,000 men November 1st to over 600,000 by the beginning of 1952. As for the North Koreans, their number remains about the same, around 225,000 military personnel. American ground forces, including the Marines, have actually slightly fallen in numbers since November 1st, from nearly 265,000 to just around 260,000. Anywhere between 16 and 28,000 replacements comes over from the States each month, and those who've served their tours of duty are rotated home. This is good for morale, but it does depress the overall troop numbers. Other UN nations have added around 2,000 men total since November, and the ROK added like 60,000 in the last 6 months, but the communists are still increasing their numerical superiority each and every month. Army G2 Intelligence Chief Andrew Bolling is putting together some estimates of everyone's strength and how it's changed since the peace talks began last July. And he will come to the conclusion that total enemy strength has risen from 72 divisions and 500,000 men to 82 divisions and 866,000 men. Enemy artillery has risen from 4 Chinese artillery divisions and some smaller under-equipped North Korean units to 8 Chinese divisions and 4 North Korean artillery brigades, all of them well equipped. Last summer, the communists had virtually no armor, and now they've got 2 Chinese armored divisions, 1 North Korean one, and even a mechanized division, all totaling 520 tanks and self-propelled guns. Most of this is of Soviet manufacture. So, despite the constant aerial interdiction campaign by UN air power against communist logistics, supply problems had lessened for the communist forces during the negotiation interval, and the combat efficiency of the enemy had shown steady improvement. Clearly, the communists had made good use of the respite generated by the truce talks and were in excellent position to continue the stalemate as long as it suited them. As for the idea of an overt rather than covert screening of prisoners to find those who might violently resist being repatriated, it seems this week the communists might be coming around to such an idea. On the 22nd, they say not only, okay, there might maybe be cases of prisoners who could get special consideration. They also say they should have closed executive sessions to discuss this, since it might be better for freer conversation. The UN guys say, sure, let's have sessions like that until one side or the other wants to return to open conference. This is agreed upon. This all might sound good, but it suddenly becomes apparent that the communists will only give special consideration to former residents of South Korea. They absolutely refuse to allow Chinese or North Korean POWs to be put in special categories. They have the huge worry that the UN will send Chinese POWs to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist China on Taiwan and not to Mao Zedong's communist China, where the volunteer army came from. Thing is, it's tough for the UN to make solid proposals about this since they really don't have an idea how many prisoners would refuse repatriation. UN Command Chief of Staff Doyle Hickey has made some guesstimates. Of the 132,000 military prisoners the UN holds, some 28,000 would prefer not to go home, but maybe only 16,000 or so would put up a fight. And of the 37,000 civilians held, most of them, like 30,000, would not want to go home, but only like 2,000 would actually fight it. He does think, though, that half of the Chinese they have, so like 10,000 or so, would not only not want to go back, but they would make a united front about it, since they are organized pretty well and they have leaders with strong nationalist sympathy. Well, no screening has been decided, and there I will leave you for this week of the war. A week of many tens of thousands of men moving laterally across the front lines in Mixmaster, and a week that contains this technical note. On March 23rd, 5th Air Force, in an effort to eliminate the pesky PO-2 Bedcheck Charlie and other small propeller-type aircraft, introduces the F-94B Night Fighter. On this day, the 319th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, equipped with the F-94Bs, relocates to Suwon. The new aircraft has long-range capability, but initially restrictions are set upon them to the highly sophisticated fire control system and classified radar equipment to keep it from being acquired by the enemy. The technology continues to improve by leaps and bounds. Overall, in the tech race, the UN forces are ahead of the communists, but we've seen that they are catching up in some areas, notably air power. Should they catch up in several others, and should their advantage in sheer numbers both on the ground and in the skies continue, and should there be an armistice and the UN forces depart, and should they decide to attack, do we really think that 10 or even 20 well-trained ROK divisions will do much to deter them? I, for one, think not. These are very troubled times, are they not? Well, I shall continue to cover them week by week, and I do so thanks to the sterling efforts of the Time Ghost Army. That is what all of our work is built on. You can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Brian Pennington is the Army Member of the Week for this channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.